Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. As you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about medical devices, consider cannabis, obsess over pharmacy, or wonder how someone will take all of these and actually keep coming back in a way that's compliant and meets their healthcare needs, this is the podcast for you. Remember, as a lawyer, I have to do it. I do have to say, not legal advice, not clinical advice. Hell, it's not even nudging advice. We're just sort of playing this out. It's educational, and I hope you enjoy it. In fact, that's why I do these podcasts. I do them because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself learning something new each time. So it'd be nice to know when someone's listening. And if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. And if you know someone who might benefit from this talk, please share. If you want to find me, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our podcast today is actually going to be really interesting. We've actually spoken about this topic before. It's the quote unquote nudging behavior. So if you are in healthcare, you've seen numerous startups pop up. I've actually worked for startups that work in the nudging world, and they are founded by some of the stalwarts in the field. So if you are in the life sciences, you're wondering how patients can actually take their medications. If you're wondering how to convince physicians that do at least listen to you and maybe find out more. If you're trying to convince pharmacists to stock your product, you probably should care about today's discussion. Our guest today is actually really quite interesting. She is a behavioral scientist at the BVA Nudge Unit, where she co-leads the healthcare division globally. So, just casual co-leading a global healthcare division. Her passion lies in the worlds of psychology, public health, and behavioral economics to craft impactful behavior changes across the healthcare ecosystem. Prior to joining BVA Nudge Unit, Suzanne developed a industry-leading social science group at a global marketing network, McCann Health. She completed her master's in public health at Columbia University's Mailman School. So our guest for today, Suzanne Kirkendall. Suzanne, how are you?
I'm doing well, Darshan. How are you?
I am well. It's good to have you. But before we continue, for those people who don't wait till the very end, how can they reach you?
You can always find me on LinkedIn, Suzanne Kirkendall, or you're welcome to send me an email at suzanne.kirkendall@bvanudgeunit.com. I love hearing from people. I love talking with people about behavioral science, obviously. So feel free to reach out.
So Suzanne, let's talk about just behavioral science in the news. What have you sort of been seeing and that's been popping up for you that's made you go, you know what? That's my field. I understand a little bit more than the average bear. So what's been showing up for you?
Oh, I can answer this a few different ways. I mean, for me, when I say that's my field, I see this stuff everywhere I look, right? Because human behavior is everywhere. It's all we see in the news. But I mean, specifically, I know there was Nudge Stock just happened a couple of weeks ago, which is a really major event in the industry. But I know, before you and I were started, we were talking about a really interesting kind of ethical issue that came up in the news recently.
So, but I mean, I'm going to get to the ethical issue, but you had me curious at Nudge Stock, because I'm imagining a bunch of hippies hanging around with guitars and free love and listening to the greatest guitar performance of all time. I'm guessing that's not what Nudge Stock is like. So
So Nudge Stock is a big annual event where they get a bunch of, really fantastic, famous, well-established behavioral scientists together to present on the latest and greatest. Obviously, this year and last year it's virtual, so they really pack it in. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend myself, but I know a bunch of my colleagues went and, of course, had a great time. But events like that are so fun because even just the marketing, you can tell it's being done by behavioral scientists. Like the subject lines of the emails just grab you in a way that's just, they really know how to tap into the motivations of their audience. So it's a lot of fun. I'll definitely be catching up on the recorded talks in a couple of weeks. But as far as hippies and guitars go, I mean, maybe after hours, but it's definitely kind of a big event during the year for us behavioral science nerds.
So It sounds like we should all be behavioral science nerds because it's just human behavior. So let's start from some of those basic things you actually referenced in what you just said. So you talked about how the emails themselves are being crafted and the subject lines are grabbing you better. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, it's something I struggle with all the time because I send out notices saying, you know what, come listen to the podcast. Or here's a really interesting bit of news that you might care about. Well, I feel like there's no good way to actually introduce that, but obviously they did it well. So talk to me about how they did it.
Yeah, so when it comes to things that seem little, like a subject line of an email, but are actually really important, because that's kind of the make or break moment of whether that person's going to engage with your entire email and everything that it's leading them to. There are a few different fun things that you can do. So, I mean, obviously, as personalized as you can make it, if you can use someone's name, that sort of thing, that's always nice. If you've ever read How to Win Friends and Influence People, one of the big principles in that book is, someone's name is the sweetest sound in the world. So as much as you can drop it, you're going to be garnering some extra attention. But beyond that, it's really about kind of conveying as quickly as possible the end value of what you're providing to someone. So not necessarily what you're actually giving them, but what it means for them if they get that educational information, for example, right? So not necessarily just 3 fun facts about, regulatory stuff in the life sciences, but, be the most interesting person at your next work get together with these facts, right? What's the actual emotional payoff, not just, literally what you're giving someone, although that should be, if you can, be clear about it. But the kind of the ultimate goal is more valuable.
That's really interesting. But here's the thing. What you're describing to me is what I see spam do badly.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's that uncanny valley. Have you ever heard that term, uncanny valley?
Yes.
Okay. For those people who haven't heard, could you tell us what it is so that we can explain that in this context?
Yeah, so uncanny valley is usually used in more of like the AI space when you're getting towards developing like AI personalities and or robots that look human enough or act human enough that you start to kind of put them mentally in that category, but they're not quite over the line of being totally convincing. So it really throws you off. So like a Roomba does not fall into that category, even though we see them as like having little personalities, we name them and, talk to them. That it's not human enough like that it freaks us out. But if you get like 90% of the way there, that's not the actual number, but just like to illustrate the concept, it just feels off because it's close, but not quite. So when it comes to these email subject lines that you're referring to in this context, it's more about like, technically they're using some of these principles that I'm dropping, but like it doesn't quite work. And so it's off-putting more than it is engaging. And that's where experience comes in. That's where having a really good knowledge of these principles and how to actually apply them and not just apply them by rote becomes important. And that's also where a test and learn philosophy becomes really important. Wherever you can kind of test, A/B test, or however else you want to test your materials, your subject lines, all of that, you're gonna have the best luck with optimizing that sort of thing.
So one of the things I've seen done in these subject lines, especially in the spammy versions of these, is a lot of emojis and a lot of colors. Was that ever appropriate? And did I just miss that memo somewhere, or what happened?
I mean, I haven't seen a lot of the colors. That's a bit much. But in terms of emojis, if you're really strategic and thoughtful about like one, that can work, right?
Yeah.
But again, you also need to know your audience. Like if this is a Sephora email, your audience probably is going to be amenable to like a heart emoji or a fire emoji more than necessarily, not stereotype, an email to a bunch of lawyers, right? At work, about work. But again, it depends. It's all very context specific. That's why this stuff gets hard. There are general principles, but then, you really got to know your audience, know the goal of the communication, and kind of know the context around it.
So what I'm hearing you say in many ways, and this is something it keeps coming back over and over and over again, is nudging is about cutting through the noise, and it's about everyone doing the same thing and you sticking out, but sticking out in a way that's good, but not sticking out in a way that's bad, and that's where you have that dip of the uncanny valley. So when you're talking about subject headlines and emails, the good news is that emoji could get you past that. No one else is doing it, but you may fall into that uncanny valley because no one else is expecting it, and there's a good reason not to do it that way.
Right.
But with the right experience, you might be able to pull it off, and that's when you reach out to Suzanne and go, "Help me here."
Right. Experience and test and learn, because I'm a scientist at heart, so I'm going to tell you got to experiment and you got to tweak and optimize. You can do as best you can with what you know up front, but every situation you're going to get the best result if you do a little experimentation. But yeah.
So what stops us from doing that? Say I am, and I don't work for them, so I want to be very clear about this. Let's say I'm Rite Aid Pharmacy, and I want to get my patients to take their medications, or quite bluntly, I don't even care if you take your medications. I care if you come pick up your medications, because then I get paid. And I have no idea if Rite Aid believes this. I'm gonna guess hopefully not. But but let's assume that that's the direction they wanted to go. How do you set up an email to remind patients to take their medications on a routine enough basis that they'll open the email and go, "Oh yeah, I should take that medication," but not enough to bore them to not open that email anymore?
Yeah. So medication adherence is the $1 billion question, right?
A little more than that, I would imagine.
At least. So there's a lot to say here. I appreciate that you're thinking in the way that, taking medication is made up of a lot of sub-behaviors, first of all, one of which is refilling your medication at the pharmacy. There's a lot more that goes into it, but when you start to think about what does it mean to adhere to your medication and what are all the little pieces that make up that overall behavior, that's when you can start to have a hope of even moving the needle a little bit. Because the problem with these big issues like medication adherence, things like health equity, like all kinds of stuff, is you want to tackle like the whole thing at once, and that's just not how change actually happens. It just doesn't. It happens bit by bit. So thinking of it in those sub-behaviors is a really good start. When it comes to kind of those other behaviors, you start to have to think again about your audience, their headspace, and the specific barriers and levers that lie between their current state and kind of this desired state. So if we're being specific about picking up the medication, well, what kind of medication is it? Does it need to be refrigerated? Is it a pill? How often do they need to go? Does it cost them money when they go or not? Can they go at convenient times? Can they get it delivered? Do they have to wait in line for 30 minutes because they can only go after work when everyone else goes? Like, you can go down the rabbit hole in all these little details, but these are the details that are make or break for any given person and will, have an aggregate effect over a certain population.
So what I'm hearing you say is, don't think of the problem you're trying to solve. Think of the many problems that come before the problem you're trying to solve. And
yeah, there's a technique in the public health field for health promotion specialists, which is kind of my original academic training, which is it's called intervention mapping. And so there's a very rigorous design approach for how to kind of establish exactly what the need is, what the barriers and levers are for kind of that desired behavior. But you use those techniques to design your intervention. But you start by defining the health problem. So you do still need to start with the big picture. So let's say the health problem is high blood pressure because you're not taking one of the reasons might be you're not taking your blood pressure medication. The health problem is high blood pressure. And then you start working your way backwards to what are the behaviors that make up that health problem or lead to that health problem. And then you start working into specific individual levers and barriers that influence that behavior, that influences that health problem. And then you start to get into what about the relationships around this person, like, spouse, doctor, family, whatever, those relationships, what levers and barriers there contribute to the health behavior. And then you think about what about kind of organizational processes contribute to the health behavior, which contributes to the health outcome. And what about the big picture societal stuff, like does their insurance cover this or not? Those sorts of things. That also contributes. So when you start thinking about how do I actually solve a problem like medication adherence, you have to think much bigger than what email do I send this person, right? Because that is a factor, and you probably will send this person emails at some point, but there's so much more that influences our behavior that you need to think about. And so that kind of layering of individual interpersonal relationships, communities and organizations, and then societal stuff, that's actually another model within this intervention mapping approach, and it's called the social ecological model. And it reminds us that we don't exist in a vacuum, basically. Everything I do, yes, it's influenced by me and the things that people directly say to me or those sorts of things, as in the case of an email. But, I'm also influenced by these other kind of spheres of influence. So when it comes to medication adherence, you have to start thinking about what are all the different ways we can kind of tweak that context for that person or that group if you really want to actually be able to change behavior.
So let me ask you this question, because it sounds like, let's say I was a pharmaceutical company and I wanted to hire you. I would go, how do I make this email better? You would pitch me the email's the last problem you're trying to solve. How does that work though? Because I imagine I'm a very smart person. I imagine that I can figure this out. Like, it's worked for billions of dollars already. Like, how much more can you teach me about how to get my patients to either take their medication or take my medication? So what is the behavioral nudge you show to demonstrate that Suzanne is the right solution for the problem, and the problem isn't what I thought it was in the first place?
Yeah, that's my job. And it's a lot of fun. No, I really enjoy, I think of myself in a lot of my role as like a translator, because, I just spouted off a bunch of like many multisyllabic model names, and that is kind of the expertise and the evidence base that I draw on in my work. But me sitting here spouting that off is not helping anyone who's not also in, my field with my lingo, right? So if I'm going to be able to provide anyone with any value, I have to be able to bridge that gap between here's all this technical jargony stuff, and here's what that means for your email subject line, right? Because it goes back to what I was suggesting with your emails in the first place, which is don't think about what am I giving this person, like the materials. Think about the value that's important to that person that I'm going to promise them that I can deliver, right? So I don't lead with, I'm going to show you the social ecological model with the intervention mapping, because that may be literally what I'm doing. But I'm going to lead with, I'm going to change your email subject lines, and I'm going to help you redesign the cadence of your patient support program. And I'm going to revamp your call guides for your patient support call center. And all of those things are going to lead to, better medication adherence. I can't make promises about percentages or anything like that, because that's not how behavior works. And I would be lying if I tried to do that. But that's kind of a really important part of being a behavioral scientist and applying it to real world problems in this way, is that translation piece.
But I'm gonna challenge you on that, because I have seen, or I know of companies who use these types of nudging technologies, and they basically come out and say that don't pay me. I want to be paid on performance. So I can't guarantee a percentage, but if I hit this percentage, you will pay me a percentage of everything above that. Mm-hmm. So aren't they in many ways guaranteeing performance then?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. And this is definitely, this is not our usual operating model, but that's definitely like, we've done this with projects before as well, and we're willing to do that. The key is it really depends on what you're applying it to. So if this is like a fairly straightforward thing where it's like, okay, I have my website and I don't have enough people applying for my credit card, right? Sure. We're losing people. They're dropping off a lot in the credit card application process. So this is like a very specific defined behavior with a really specific defined context. We can go in, we can make some tweaks, and we can be like, we know just based on best principles, like you guys weren't at best principles yet, just kind of on a basic level. So if we can tell you this, like is probably going to work, right? We can be fairly confident because there is such an evidence base behind it and because this is something that's really, really defined, right? When it comes to things like really complicated behaviors like medication adherence, then it starts to be a matter of, well, I mean, do we have the scope to influence the things that we know need to be influenced, which is a lot more than tweaking the wording on your credit card application process, right? So then it becomes kind of a give and take. But I don't think anybody's going to be guaranteeing I can get you a 10% lift in this, right? Like nobody's going to do that. And a lot of people want that because we love certainty, right? But that's not how this sort of thing works. But definitely pay for performance is totally fine. It's going to be a case by case thing. And it's something that we do sometimes when the situation is appropriate.
So we talk about pay for performance, that being okay. But let's take that into, and you made a reference to it because we had a prior conversation about this. There have been scenarios, and I'll drop a link about this. There have been scenarios where companies have gotten into trouble for using nudging behavior in an inappropriate way, specifically in the opioid epidemic situation. Could you talk a little bit more about what happened there, and then we can delve a little bit more into the ethics and how do you do it right, and how do you do it in a way that may not get you into trouble?
Yeah, so I'm not totally across all the details of this latest news. I think Darshani, you're going to have a better summary than I would, but basically one of the EHR software companies just got in very big trouble with a massive fine because they were inappropriately pushing opioid prescriptions within the way that they design their EHR software and its alerts. That's my summary understanding. Do you want to add some color?
Absolutely. Essentially what they were doing was they were using EHR software. And for those of you who don't know what that is basically the software that physicians use or prescribers use to order certain medications. What they were doing, and again, I haven't dug in too deep into this, but essentially what they were doing was nudging you saying, well, have you considered opioid here? Now, the question is that behavior necessarily bad? Obviously, the settlement suggests that the DOJ at least views it as bad. But is the actual behavior of saying, have you considered this medication necessarily bad? Or was it the opioid part that made it more problematic? Yeah. So let's start with that question. Was it the drug or the behavior?
I think it's both. So by that, I mean, you got to start looking at the motivation for any kind of intervention that you're designing. Like why are you doing this? Who are you doing this for? Who does this benefit, right? At the Nudge Unit, we talk about, we always strive to do win-win-win type projects where it's, a win for the client, a win for whoever's kind of the end user or target of the intervention, and a win for society. And that's kind of our little litmus test for, is this a project we want to work on? And ideally, everybody who's nudging does the same thing. But I mean, obviously, not always the case, given the example you just shared. So when it comes to things like this case, where the opioids were being suggested during the opioid epidemic,
well, let's be fair. I'm not sure if it was during the opioid epidemic. It may have been, but I'm not sure if it was.
It's been going on for a long time, and if we're talking about EHR software, it's probably still an issue that's come up. You have to look at the motivation, right? Is this really for the patient's benefit? Because that's the person that it's impacting at the end of the day. And there are absolutely appropriate cases to use opioids. There are very specific instances. They're not meant to be, used a lot, right? So in this case, the opioids, you have to think extra hard given the context. I'm always going to go back to the context. In terms of the actual behavior of a pop-up or whatever alert suggesting, have you considered such and such, whatever prescription it might be? That's another case where you really have to look at the context and the reason that you're doing it to be able to judge the ethics. If it's a case where, we know that a standard of care is just underprescribed for convenience reasons, then it might be the case where it's like, no, this is appropriate to do. So like a really classic example would be cardiac rehabilitation after a heart attack. So this is something that's standard of care technically, that's supposed to be done in almost all cases after someone's had a heart attack, where they're referred for the physiotherapy and the rehab to kind of get themselves back up to speed afterwards. However, in real life, this happens like a fraction of the time that it should, because usually there's a lot of different things going on. It's too complicated to refer. There's a lot of paperwork to fill out. There's a lot of what we call sludge, which are the things that add friction to any given process, as opposed to nudges, which remove friction. So in cases like that, where it really is in the patient's best interest, there was like some kind of barrier there that we've identified that's preventing that thing in the patient's best interest to be happening. An alert like, have you made sure that you referred such and such to cardiac rehab is actually appropriate, right? It's bringing things into line with, again, evidence-based medicine. So that's where it's always going to come back to, it depends on the context with these. There's very little black and white, like this is always bad, this is always okay when it comes to this sort of thing.
So I'm going to give you a more legal perspective on that.
Yeah.
So the more, and again, this is just what our skill sets are. So this is not, I'm not disagreeing with you necessarily.
No, I love it. I'm curious.
But yeah. So my perspective would be the way the DOJ, OIG look at this is it causing an extra cost to the government that they didn't have to bear before? So if you're talking about cardiac care, cardiac rehab, if you will, and that's part of what they were going to pay for anyways, and you're basically saying, I'm reducing readmission rates, I am helping patients, there's no additional cost to the government, and this is a neutral decision that just helps patients. And again, I have no idea if it is in this case. Yeah, I'm definitely totally okay with that. However, let's say you come up with a new fangled cardiac care process that you're going to charge extra for, that you are paying to have nudged for, that is pushing your competition aside in favor of you, and you're paying to have to be marketed and sort of put out, that would cause some red flags to be raised for you to look at. So it's not just the ethics of it, but the cost associated with it. So every time I see, and I've been in a few different situations where this type of scenario has been raised, whenever I see you as a company being the only provider that's providing something and then causing that nudge to happen, and you're not providing options, that's when I start going, wait a second, why? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The more options we can provide nudges for at that particular moment in time, the more likely it is it would survive scrutiny, because the government will go, look, what you're saying is, and I'm making this up, mm-hmm. The patient was in pain. You provided the option of ibuprofen, tramadol, and an opioid. And those were three options given to them. They chose the one they wanted. It was neutralized. But you still thought that you were addressing the pain situation. That's a very different situation from, here's a great opioid medication you can use right at this moment. Why don't you prescribe it now? And that's the difference. So I think that would be the give and take you need to be aware of as you continue. But sorry, did I cut you off there?
No, not at all. I think it's really interesting, and it's important to weigh in these different perspectives, right? Because the other thing, as we progress with how do you make something ethical, as a kind of general theme is, you need to involve various stakeholders, right? So it's not just me and BVA Nudge Unit who decides what's ethical and that's it. And it's not just, in this case, the pharma company or the HR company that decides. You need to also pull in other stakeholders with other perspectives. Obviously, legal is appropriate sometimes, in this case, definitely. But also the end users who this is going to be made for. So talk to your HCPs, get your patients involved, make sure that everybody who's touched by this has a chance to weigh in, and that's best practice.
So I'm sorry, Suzanne, I'm going to ask you to repeat something that we started with already, but I just got a message from a friend who's a high-level healthcare executive, and I'm not going to paraphrase. I'm going to just say the words. What the F is nudging in the life sciences?
I love it. It's a good question. So nudging is kind of a subset of behavioral science, which is all around behavioral science broadly is like psychology, anthropology, sociology, behavioral economics. We'll get into that in a second. Basically, like, how do people actually make decisions? Therefore, how do we use well-known techniques to guide them to make, hopefully better decisions, right? So nudging is kind of a specific way of doing this, which is providing little changes to the moment that someone is making a choice. So that context around a decision moment, whether that's, a website and how you've arranged your website to get people to subscribe, that's a decision moment with a context, or whether that's how you design your hospital building so people can easily find their way around, that's a decision moment and a context. Things that you do to that context to remove friction and make it easy for people to take the path you want them to take. So the trick with nudging is it's usually very tactical. It's usually very specific. We're not talking about, here's our giant marketing campaign. That's not a nudge. You can have executions of that campaign, might be nudges, but they're very specific tactics, and they're not removing choice, right? So going back to the ethics of this, I'm not making it illegal for someone to prescribe Tylenol, therefore they're going to prescribe opioids, right? I'm just making it easier. I'm removing friction between, choice between your person and kind of that desired choice outcome. But they're welcome to opt out and choose something else, right? So that's where you start to get into the ethics. Like, I'm guiding you. I'm lighting up this particular path, but I haven't closed the doors on all the others for you. So nudging in life sciences can be applied to a lot of different things, right? We've been talking about medication adherence. We've been talking about prescribing behaviors. This can go towards, how do your sales reps communicate in effective ways? How do you facilitate HCP patient communication in better ways? Like, if you think of any kind of, if you're talking to a healthcare executive, what are your business KPIs, right? At the end of the day, those are going to boil down to somebody doing something, right? Whether that's your employees, because you can nudge your employees as well, or whether that's your customers, your end users, somebody in between on that path.
That was awesome. I also think it was like the perfect way to end this conversation, because we started, we usually, as you know, aim 15, 20 minutes of these conversations, and we haven't even touched the topics we hope to get to. So no. We can keep going for hours. This is, as always, amazing. So let's ask a couple of questions for you, Suzanne. First question, what is something you'd like to ask the audience based on what we discussed?
I'd be curious to hear what nudges they've noticed in their own healthcare interactions. Now that we're talking about, I'm throwing out so many examples of where these can live. I challenge folks to start seeing them in their day-to-day lives.
So I always try to answer the question that's asked. So my first response would be, I feel like every email marketing message is a nudge. The vast majority of them are done incredibly badly, because all I want to do is stop the spam. So what I see is, here's what I can do for you, not here's how you will benefit from what I can do for you. So I see nudging behaviors near constantly. Looking out, seeing a billboard is a nudging behavior, but if it doesn't speak to me, doesn't speak to my needs, doesn't speak to my emotional goals, it's badly done, at least from my perspective. So nudging is what I see as the parent of promotion. Haven't
heard it referred to that way, but I like it. That's fun.
There you go. Or the parent of decision making, either one. It's a lot. It sires a lot of kids.
Well, it's funny you use parent language, because so there's a really famous book called Nudge, which I would recommend to your commenter as a really nice, very readable introduction to the field. But the original title of that book was going to be Asymmetric Paternalism, which just isn't quite as mass market appealing. But that's kind of right, exactly. But that's kind of the principle behind this, is like, I'm guiding you And it's the power dynamics a little uneven because I just shaped your environment, but like it's not like total paternalism. It's fine. Like it's fine.
It's the difference. Here's my question. Is it, and I think it's a superpower. It's the difference between the doctor telling you, take your medication, it's going to make you better, or the neighborhood crack dealer saying, here's one more hit. And you've got to basically go, I need to use it for good. It's got to be because it's a win-win scenario for everyone involved. And,
That's right.
if you do it badly, you're looking at $145 million fines.
That's right. Well, they did it effectively, but they did bad.
I guess so. I guess that's true.
Right.
Well, I guess that comes down to the question of what is effective. Is it effective if everyone doesn't win in the first place? So there you go.
It's a good question.
So that was my first question. My second question: what did you learn in the last week?
Ooh, in the last week? What did I learn? I learned, honestly, totally unrelated, but it's coming to mind. I went out to dinner for the first time, like to sit at a restaurant outside still. But I relearned and re-remembered how beautiful New York City is because I got to go sit on the water and look at the sunset and feel a little bit normal for a second.
Right? God, it's been good to just see life coming back to normal. And then I remember how much I hate life as it's normal because there's just too many people out there.
Right. I relearned that, it's actually not that nice to take the subway.
Exactly. What is something that made you happy, not counting what you just told me, in the last month?
In the last month? Honestly, the work I've gotten to do with some of my clients in the last month has been like totally genuinely like awesome. Like really excited about kind of what we're doing, getting to work on projects that are genuine win-win-wins with, clients who really care and really are engaged, and we're all kind of pushing each other to do some really cool new thinking. So it's been a long month, but it's been awesome. That's made me very pleased.
There you go. And how can people reach you again?
So please find me on LinkedIn, Suzanne Kirkendall, or send me an email directly at suzanne.kirkendall@bvanudgeunit.com. As I said at the beginning, and as always happens, because Darshan has to make me stop talking about this, I love talking about behavioral science. So please, reach out, even if it's just a question or a fun fact you want to share. I love hearing from you.
That's awesome. I do want to do a quick summary of what we talked about. We landed up starting off with just what was happening that was memorable, which really took us to a virtual conference that you did not attend, but we had a lot of opinions about. So we talked about subject lines that came from that. We got into personalization. We talked about the end value and not so much about what you're giving. And we obviously pulled that back in at the end. For example, don't talk about 3 tips I can tell you about regulatory affairs because no one cares. Talk about how to be the most interesting person in the room. And that appeals to everyone's emotional needs. And then test. We then tried to tie that into the multi-billion-dollar question of medication adherence. And I asked the very simple question of how do you solve it? And why is this so difficult? And why haven't we done it already? What you explained to me was, no, that's actually the end. That's almost the last question you're answering of the many, many questions you have to get to before that. And you talked about things like intervention mapping and removing obstacles. And then there was another sociological term you used, which I can't remember. What was that one?
Social ecological model.
Social ecological model. There you go. And then we sort of pivoted into ethics. And we talked about this penalty and this fine around nudging using EHRs. And how do you do it right? Can you do it right? Versus how do you do it wrong and how to avoid doing it wrong? And what are some considerations as you start doing that? We then talked a little bit about the opioid epidemic that came out of that as well. And then we ended with the very simple question of sorry about that.
You left us on a cliffhanger. What's the simple question? I don't know.
It was a behavioral nudge. You waited, so that was perfect. The very simple question we tried to answer was, what the F is nudging in the life sciences? So that's how we ended. And did I miss anything, Suzanne?
No, that was great.
Okay. Awesome. If you have any more questions, you can reach me at Darshan Talks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. And we'd really love it if you'd leave a comment, please subscribe. Or if you know someone who might enjoy this podcast, please share it. So again, thank you everyone for coming on. We hope you enjoyed this. I know I did. So that was great.
Thank you. It's great to join you again.